Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Composer's Cut podcast. I am your host, Mathew. I'm a composer and cellist based in Chicago, and I'm really excited about today's episode because I got to sit down with the amazing composer, Niki Harlafti. I had the pleasure of doing my PhD at Northwestern University alongside Niki. We entered at the same year, and so we became very good friends, and we've gotten to know each other as composers and people over the years. In this conversation, Niki and I talk about many of the different aspects of her music, from the formal elements to the way in which a musical idea is sort of formed and the various ways that she finds her way into a piece, whether that's through narrative or sonic exploration, a particular instrumentation, a concept. And so we really go into the details of how these different things flourish and are developed into a musical work, which in Niki's case are always these very rich interdisciplinary tapestries that are not just music or just dance or just some other, expressive form. They all kind of coexist in this inseparable way, and Niki talks about her inability to actually separate these things as an artist and how she has broken down the artificial boundaries that we create between the various art forms and our experience as people in the real world. Specific pieces that we discuss from both like musical and conceptual frameworks are Kintsugi for 11 saxophones, as well as Khe Theemen for vocal ensemble, and The Blood of Others, a musical theater work that was recently premiered by Ben Roydell Ward. It's for a solo bassoonist in his bedroom, and I'll save all of the interesting aspects of this for the talk. So I look forward to sharing these details with you. As I said, it really exposes the interdisciplinary nature of Niki's expressive voice and how all of these different aspects of music and dance and the various art forms coalesce into one cohesive tapestry. Niki was very generous in sharing all of the different ways in which she thinks about her music, all of the different aspects of her experience as a Greek musician, her connections to her country, her connections to history, and all of these different aspects of her musicianship that inform her work. And so without further ado, here's my conversation with the amazing composer, Niki Harlafti.
Thank you so much for having me here today at your home studio.
Thank you so much for coming. This is the first interview that I'm doing in person, so I'm excited about that. And I'm excited to be talking about your music. I have a lot of questions for you. I have some things that I'd like to learn, particularly about some recent works like Khe Theemen for the vocal ensemble work, as well as The Blood of Others, which is the musical theater work for a solo bassoonist. So there are a lot of different layers or dimensions of the music that we can dig into, but maybe the first place that I'd like to start, because this is one of the things that fascinates me the most as a composer, is learning about other people's compositional process. So can you tell me a little bit about where a musical idea typically starts for you?
Mm-hmm. So there's no typical place. That's I think I bet you get that answer a lot.
Sometimes, yeah,
right?
it's yeah, definitely.
Yes. So for me, it really depends. Sometimes it's patterns that I want to break, which is also, as you've seen in my description, as my personal description as an artist, I like taking patterns that are either traditional or well-established or recognizable. I think that's the better word, and to break them. And then maybe put them back together, creating something new. So, for example, Kintsugi for 11 saxophones I've broken the Passacaglia and Fugue in Bach Passacaglia, right, in C minor.
Right.
And I've turned it into an 11 saxophone piece,
Right.
and it's put back together. You know the meaning of Kintsugi, right? Putting things together.
Yeah, maybe you can talk a little bit about that, in case there are any listeners that aren't familiar with the term.
Absolutely. So Kintsugi is the technique of taking broken pottery or porcelain or whatever and putting it together with gold, gluing it back together with gold. And it's a Japanese practice that is meant to honor the scars of existence and the scars of an object and give them new life by accentuating their scars, not hiding them.
Yeah. Not hiding them with Botox or something.
Exactly. So what I've done in that piece is I've broken Bach and I've put him back together in a way that's new and kind of disturbing, but interesting. And the catharsis in the end is all the more interesting. I think it's all the more intense, I would say. Similarly, I have borrowed other patterns, it be from Mahler, the Adagietto for a solo guitar piece that I wrote, it be from why can't I think of something? Oh, I'm using the ancient Greek hymn. Khe Theemen is from themes for Apollo's death, and ancient Greek rituals. So I do like a connection with tradition and history. So that's one place where my music starts. Other places are just a visceral gesture, a feeling, right? It could be just a sonic impulse. It could be, sorry, compound sound, like a complex sonority, something. Or it could be just movement, just an instrument moving a specific way. Other times it's narrative. And other times it's literature, it's a poem that moves me. It's a subject like war, like in my vocal work, The Demilitarized Zone or Enduring Freedom. Both of those have to do with war. So it really depends what the subject is. And more recently, I would say, which and I you could share our discussions when I was writing The Blood of Others, because in the case of The Blood of Others, I was inspired by all the tragedies that my country was going through, and that's where the piece started.
You mentioned like pattern breaks,
yes,
and trying to sort of like disrupt the pattern or break the pattern. Does that transfer to like all of these different approaches? So if you're starting from like a narrative or more sound-based kind of sound building versus some other form into, or some other way into a piece, are you always looking for like some way to like subvert expectations or something like that?
I think.
Or does that come from a different place?
So in the text, I'll to be honest, when I'm working with the text, because I really respect text, I try to serve it. That doesn't mean that I'm traditional, but it heavily depends on the text. So if you have a surrealist poem, you can't treat it the same way as you would a sonnet by Edna Millay or so when working with text, I respect the narrative that it sort of carves out. But with everything else, with the subversion of expectation, I guess I am very interested in surprise, in subverting expectation in general, in contrast, in antithesis. Other composers are only interested in the obfuscating form, or never setting up any pattern, just keeping the listener
constantly
guessing,
sort of in the dark or something.
Yes, I don't do that deliberately. I'm not that kind of composer, but I am very interested in the antithesis of bursts of energies and different states of being in a piece. Typically, my piece won't have like one note. I don't have a better way of explaining. There's not a one dimension in my piece where you hear something and you go, oh, that the rest of the piece is going to be like that.
Right. So, going back to this piece, Kintsugi for 11 saxophones, it's interesting that you chose to set this Bach piece and break it apart and reconstitute it with 11 saxophones, because I think the saxophone wasn't even invented in his lifetime. And so the choice of instrumentation and the choice of the source material for the piece is interesting. Can you talk a little bit about, why Bach in that particular instance?
Thank you. That's very interesting, because that came from dance. That came from a contemporary ballet that is called Le Jeune Homme et la Mort, the young man and death. And I saw this choreography. So the original, the Bach Passacaglia, was written for organ.
Right.
In that, where I first saw it was in Baryshnikov's film White Nights. And it's the opening scene is the choreography of The Young Man in Death, where there's a young man in his room and there is a noose in the room and he's looking at his watch, which has stopped, and he's waiting for death. And death is a woman, of course, who comes in and shows him the noose. And at the end of the choreography, he hangs himself. And the intensity of Bach's music, of that specific passacaglia in that piece was just so gut-wrenching for me that I said, I need to do something with this. And I just thought of the saxophones because I had this big commission. My simultaneous thought was, I want this to be a ballet. I want this to be choreographed, but we're going to make it about the young woman in life. So the so at the same time,
inverting certain kinds of things.
Exactly. I inverted I turned it on its head and said, why don't we make it about a woman who's forced to give birth? And this is the political dimension of my work. And that's what I did. There's this woman who is being, there's a red thread being pulled out of her.
Right. I remember seeing a performance of that.
Yes, exactly. I was so happy that I did that. So that's my other source of inspiration, right? It might be dance, it might be movement, it's interdisciplinary often.
Right. Here's an excerpt from Niki Harlafti's Kintsugi for 11 saxophones. Yeah, that's actually something that I was interested in sort of like touching on, because I know that you've also worked with filmmakers and choreographers and sometimes at the same time. And so can you talk a little bit about, obviously in this case of Kintsugi, the idea isn't necessarily just like, going through a list of scores and being like, oh, why not Bach? It's a little bit more complex, and there are more dimensions to it, of course. And they obviously are reflecting your interests in sort of your role as maybe as an activist in life. And so I feel that, it's
and my past in dance as well, my background in dance.
Right? So this interdisciplinary trajectory that you're sort of on, I'm curious, like, how that has informed your composition ideas. And, pieces like The Blood of Others, for example, which are theatrical in nature, feel very different from a piece like Kintsugi, right? Because it feels like there are other layers going on that aren't just like, reconstituting a Bach passacaglia or whatever. It's like it feels more dense when it's interdisciplinary. So can you talk a little bit about that in your work?
Ooh, thank you. That's a a question. I have 10 tabs in my head open to answer this accurately. First of all, one of the biggest compliments anyone's ever given me was by your wife.
Oh, really?
Yes, who had said, no matter what you write, I always know it's you. I always know it's your
that's
work.
Wonderful.
Yes, I don't see it, but I'm so glad someone does, see it that way.
Well, we can't hide who we are, I guess.
Right? I guess your wife knows me better than I think. Understands, my soul.
She's very perceptive.
She is. So about interdisciplinarity and how that informs, and all the sides of me that inform who I am, it's subconscious. I can't put a needle on it. It just happens to me. My brain, my lateral thinking, I think, is one of my biggest gifts. And I understand how to use transferable skills. I just sort of instinctively do it in my work as an activist, in my work as in arts admin, in teaching, in, let's say, all of the knowledge that I acquired in scouting and event organizing and making art with amateurs in the Guides and Scouts Association, I used in my pedagogy and also in my composing, because there's so much empirical art that's made with people who are not trained. And for the longest time, I couldn't distinguish the music from the dance. I didn't know, because I was dance trained and wanted to be a classical ballet dancer for the longest time, until I decided that eating is more important. And my body started changing. For the longest time, I remember dancing and not knowing whether I like the dance more or the music. And it's no coincidence that in other cultures, there is no term just for music. There's rituals, right, where you dance and sing and play percussion.
Right.
I remember studying that in ethnomusicology in my bachelor's degree. That's a barrier that anthropologists have to face, that music isn't perceived separately.
Right.
It's part of this social ritual that we have and our interaction. It's not separate from life. That's an artificial division.
Right.
So for me, I feel that music is just one of the parameters and one of the layers in my self-expression, and it sort of happens naturally.
And it's kind of, I guess, how other people perceive you. Like, that's like the one thing that, that you identify as a composer. Yes. And you present your work in concerts.
You're right.
But yeah, I especially like in The Blood of Others, and I know I keep coming back to this piece, so maybe we can
let's
talk
talk
a little
about
bit.
it.
Yeah, so there's a moment in the piece where the performer, in this case Ben Roydal Ward, amazing bassoonist that we all love, he begins to dance, sort of responding to the music or the things that he's hearing on the radio. Yes. And so I guess, like, even though you seem to have kind of chosen the path of music, dance doesn't really go away, right?
It does not. It just keeps chasing me. And my dancer friends keep wanting to choreograph my music. They find it danceable.
Right.
They want
and I guess, your connection to movement and your past as a dancer is, as you said, inescapable, and it's going to resurge in your music over and over again. And there are different ways that this happens. And now I'm just sort of like free-flowing, thinking again about Khe Theemen. There's this moment towards the end of the piece when the male singers or the male characters, the warriors attacking the city, begin to sort of clap or stomp. And so there's obviously always these moments of the body interacting in your music and movement taking a more predominant role than you might see in other people's work, which may, going back to what my wife said about recognizing you in your music, that is something that is very personal and that does say something more, like, this is Niki Harlafti's music. Do you know what I mean?
I do, absolutely.
So,
and thank you for making that connection. The body is always relevant. I do feel that. And in Khe Theemen, yes, so there was emotion in ancient Greece. I don't know if there's any equivalent expression of grief in other cultures, but in Greece, you would hit your chest when somebody died. So there would be professional grievers, professional mourners, right? So the mirologitres. So instead of, let's say the widow crying, you'd hire an expert crier, mourner, widow, and it was like, "Ay, my husband, my flower, my rock," and they would be hitting their chests like that.
Sort of using their body's percussion.
Yes, yeah. To just express like the utmost frustration and grief and anger. And at the same time, so that I've drawn from tradition, and once
Right.
again we see that it's a social ritual, right? Mourning was singing for mourning was a formalized social, I don't know what to call it, social tradition. It was a formalized thing, which served a very clear purpose in ancient
to
Greek
externalize
society.
one's mourning and grief and outsourcing it, I guess.
Exactly, outsourcing the grief, and then
To a
the widow
professional.
would get to sit like this and be all pretty crying, and because she had hired the best mourners.
Right.
And that shows the importance of the professional musicians, and we hire professional musicians at weddings. That's not very different.
Right.
At the same time, music was relevant in war as well. So in order to stay in formation, and this is, again, we're talking about Khe Theemen and where that part comes from, the warriors stomping
Right. In unison or
their feet.
Yeah.
Exactly. So what they did, they were in formation, especially Spartans for sure, and they had people playing the diavlos, which was a double sort of, I don't know how to say avlos in, again.
maybe like was it a brass or woodwind instrument?
It was a woodwind. It was from
like a recorder, maybe?
Yes, like a double recorder type thing. Half the notes were on the one, and the other half were on the other, and they both met in the mouth.
Right.
So they had two people playing that double recorder, one on each side, and that would give the soldiers an idea of how big the unit was, that the unit they were in. At the same time, they would stomp and sing. They had peanes, the Spartan peanas, the peanas of war. That's what it is. It's the rhythmic hymn that they would sing to not only to pump each other up for battle, but also to stay in formation while they walk.
Right.
And so that's a very, very real thing that I had no idea was happening.
Right.
Music is very, very functional and
Totally.
absolutely real in society, absolutely incorporated. It's
Right.
not outside of society. I guess I've said this a couple times already.
Yeah.
I'm having
it's,
trouble
and
seeing
again,
how
they are
separate it is.
artificial barriers or divisions that we create, even between the arts or our daily life or interaction with the arts, which is tragic because then we lose all of these connections to history, to the role of the body and our expression. And so I think that, your work in incorporating these different elements and sort of like reconstituting them in a sort of conceptual Kintsugi way in your music, I think is admirable and yields really interesting and thought-provoking results. And so in that piece, Khe Theemen, I'm also interested like how these two different you mentioned
environments.
like the priestesses sort of like singing their I guess they're mourning the death and resurrection of Adonis, as well as like the warriors outside, and then the oracles singing their prophecies. I'm curious about the musical materials chosen for each of the three different characters and how it sort of unfolds throughout the work. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely, because that was the hardest part to put together, but at the same time my instinct put the two together. I don't know how it happened. Again, it's this magical moment
sort of
of
lateral
inspiration.
thinking thing.
Yes, and you don't have to know, that's my point, you don't have to know how you're going to place the musical materials together. And that's one thing that has changed throughout in my process throughout the years. I just trust that if I want to put two things together, I'm going to find a way.
Right.
Whereas when I was younger, I was stressing about the specifics. You know, I would stress about every transition even. And now I just believe that if I believe they go together, they will go together.
Right.
So what the women are singing about is they're lamenting Adonis.
Right.
So they're lamenting a god. The Adonia mysteries were the precursors, or rather the inspiration behind Christ's resurrection. So that was already happening with Adonis. When Adonis in English, would die, nature would die and we'd have winter. And when his resurrection came, then spring came. And they even had a procession around with flowers, flower pots, and something that looks like the epitaph that we have in Catholicism and in Orthodox Christian religions, where you go around with the epitaph, which is essentially the body of the dead god, the son of God in Christianity, right? God in ancient Greece. And so the professional lamenters, which are the priestesses in this occasion, are actually lamenting the death of a god. And there is this incident which inspired me, historical incident, during which a warrior or a political official was near the walls of Athens right before a big battle. And the lamenters were so convincing, the priestess's mourning, that he took it as a bad omen, that they were going to lose in battle. He said, this is what's going to happen. The women are going to be mourning their dead this way. I think it was ahead of a battle against Carthage or something like that. And that's why I thought the women are doing their part, the men are doing their part, and what happens when they meet. Rhythmically, that wasn't very hard to put together because the women do the chest, they hit their chests, and the men have the foot stomps.
Right.
So and then everyone does everything. So the hymn I've borrowed for the women to sing is from an actual lament of Adonis. And the paean is the Spartan paean, which you can now find online because it's been reconstructed and fully performed.
Oh, it's amazing.
In England by a society that's all about ancient Greek music. And so I saw where they overlap, although their rhythms are slightly different. There's common elements, there's scales that you can use and modes that can go together. And I tweaked both slightly and connected them.
Just looked for ways to bridge these two materials.
Yes, with our very classic contrapuntal, mode tweaking tricks that we do to bring materials together, and turning some elements into drones, right? When I wanted to, so the oracles in the middle, or the priest with a higher voice, right? So essentially the high tenor is holding a note, which helps connect the two. And although their materials are distinct in the beginning, and the women do the lament and the men sing the paean, then they sort of all merge together in chaos.
Right. I was also wondering, as I was listening, especially to the warriors stomping, because obviously in a concert situation, you have a limited number of performers that are not the size of an army. I wonder if you're also interested in sort of evoking kind of the scale of the force that's going to be attacking. I don't know, by incorporating either more performers and specifying this must be for 48 singers or whatever, and specifying the size of the groups, or maybe using drums in the case of smaller ensembles. I'm curious if that's something that crossed your mind as you were working on the piece, or if you wanted it always to have this very sort of corporal percussive aspect to it.
Thank you. Yes, I would be very curious to see what a larger ensemble would do. Something that really helped in this case, although we didn't have, unfortunately, mics just for my piece, just for their feet, or just for the chests. However, we were in a church. And that made such a big difference.
Totally.
What you hear is 5 people.
Wow.
It's 5.
Oh, I thought it was at least 12 or 18 or something.
That's the church for you. That's the church resonance. So
amazing.
it's so important to have the right space.
Totally.
And you know how they say, this is a fun anecdote. You know how we go paranoid with just detailing everything in our instructions?
Right.
I thought of writing, wear shoes that have a hard sole. But I didn't. One of the performers showed up with shoes that have the little separate fingers.
Oh, really?
For shoe, and I said, what are the odds of this
That's
happening?
so funny. My son has some Crocs that are like that.
Exactly. You're like, what are the odds? And that's why composers are psycho about writing down every little detail. So I think...
No, I wonder, though, if the timbre of that stomp of that particular shoe might have been potentially more bassy, particularly in a church. I don't know was it like
Maybe.
stone surfaces or
It was
wood?
stone. I don't remember whether they were on a wooden platform. It's possible.
Yeah, because it might have been too high pitched if you had specified a hard soul. I don't
you're
know.
right.
Possibly.
And
Anyway.
there's other tricks you can do. You can add, even I thought of anklets with percussive bells or whatever else. But yeah, there's a lot we can do.
Yeah. I also, what if some of the performers were using the flutes or the recorders that you mentioned? Is that something that crossed your mind as well? Or was this always meant to be purely just like a vocal work?
That was meant to be a vocal work just
So it
because...
doesn't have to be like a literal one-to-one translation
No,
of the...
absolutely not.
Yeah,
I'm beyond that. Also, I wouldn't use the flutes yet just because I want it to be performed as
Right.
much as possible. Because
Totally.
those flutes, it's a specialization. There's
No, of course,
two
yeah.
performers who know how to do that well. So...
No, of course, and of course, it would probably end up being maybe a modernized version where you have two people playing like a composite line. Anyway,
that's a good idea.
yeah. So yeah, now maybe pivoting to the blood of others. There are other like moments where it's not just bassoon, right? Obviously, like Ben in that performance was dancing or like yelling goal when the soccer team gets the goal and wins like the championship. And so I you've mentioned already your connection to history, ancient Greece, but in that piece I feel like it's also very overtly exposing a modern Greek person's experience in the world and all of the different tragedies that come up on these radios, as well as like you mentioned like the Orthodox Christian religions. The opening of the piece has these like what feels similar to Gregorian chant. I know obviously it's different, but can you talk a little bit about the trajectory of the choice of materials in that piece, like from like the use of singing in the mass to having journalists reporting these horrific tragic events of, you know, like immigrants in a boat that capsizes and they all sadly lose their lives and things like that, and the choice of materials and then the way the piece unfolds. And yeah, maybe we can sort of like...
Absolutely. I mean, you're a composer yourself, and I'm sure you understand how complex it was to put all that together.
Yeah, I mean, it was like a huge puzzle piece that I imagine was like very, very complex.
So many materials.
Yeah.
That
but
were
masterfully
very
put
different.
together. And like you said, you have this like lateral thinking where you make these connections and you put these things together and they provoke so many thoughts and emotions, and so it's very, as you said, not one-dimensional and very, very complex. So I'm curious about the process of putting things together for you.
So for background about this piece, I was stuck in Greece because my employment authorization card in the US had been stolen in the mail. So I was in my home country, which is a great feeling. However, because I was there for 5.5 months, also worried about my future in the US, I was there for major tragedies. I was there for, no, actually I wasn't there, but a train accident, a horrid train accident had happened on February 28, 2023. In that train accident in Greece, 57 people died. Half of them, approximately, didn't die from the collision itself, which was preventable, could have been, if anything worked. So we're talking gross government negligence after government after government after government hadn't used the funds the way they should have for maintenance. And so half of them died from the collision, but the other half died from the fumes. The fumes came from illegal flammable substances that were being transferred, that were traveling on the other train with which the passenger train collided. That's when other issues arose, right? Of, illegal trade and how long has this been happening? Why are the trains in such a poor condition? And those people who died were mostly young people, students, traveling from one city to the other. So it was gut-wrenching. It was very similar to, Black Lives Matter. The entire country shut down.
Right.
And apart from that, a few months later, all of Greece burned because the summer came. And similarly to California, the entire country just burns in the summer. Is there government negligence involved? Always, because
Right.
they don't want to hire firemen because, or firefighters in general, because it's a seasonal profession pretty much, and they don't want to be spending those funds there. And then ironically, in Tempe, where the train accident happened, that's our biggest valley. That's where our agriculture heavily depends upon the agricultural production of the Tempe Valley. And the entire valley of Tempe flooded.
Oh my gosh.
At the same time, and we had been warned by Europe in 2018, which I have in my piece, that there's
The
a very
flooding was
slim
imminent
chance of
and-
this happening,
yeah.
but if it happens,
I
everything
see.
drowns. Your cattle, your homes, everything, and you had all of these dead animals, infested waters, infested lands, ruined crops. It was just horrible.
Right.
And at the same time, we have a record number of femicides, people killing each other at soccer games, just violence from everywhere, which really started spiking during COVID and never stopped, and it's just getting worse and worse.
Wow.
And so amidst all this, I was asked to write a piece for Bassoon. And I was like, really? Is that what we're going to be doing here?
Right.
And I remember texting you, so you can say a little bit about that, how our discussion went.
Well, what I remember was I was at the park with my son, and I was just like, well, I'm gonna try to make this a little bit interesting for me. Because not to say that my son is not interesting, but I think he was only like 3 at the time in 2023. Yeah, so he's almost 3, or maybe it was 2024. I can't remember the exact year, but yeah, I just remember you talking about this bassoon idea that you had, and you weren't really sure how you wanted to make it work. That you had been kind of inspired by Après-Gui's music, and how you wanted to incorporate some kind of like theatrical elements to it. And so we were just sort of like brainstorming back and forth, and the thought came up that you might include like televisions playing in the background with like different things on local TV stations or whatever. And I think the ultimate rendition of the piece was that there were 2 radios that were being triggered by different sources. And so, yeah, I think that it's nice to have sort of been a small part of the impetus for that piece, but I think like obviously like it became so much more than that initial conversation. So these tragic events feed into the work, and they are obviously influencing the psychology or the psyche of the performer in a very big way, right? And sometimes kind of like it feels like whiplash, because you see like he's interacting with the mass, and then there are these reports of horrible tragic events, and then there's like news of the goal that won Greece the national championship, or the Euro championship. And so I feel like there's obviously like a lot of different layers and dimensions, and I feel that the way that I perceive the piece and how I interpret it, which is going to be maybe watered down, and it's so much more than what I'm going to say, but I feel that by the end of the piece, the performer is so overwhelmed by the barrage of information, good and bad, that he just like cuts himself off from it by covering his eyes, attempts to, and you hear the kind of fixed media or the different electronic elements or layers gradually transforming into white noise.
Yes.
And so that's a very profound statement, and I don't think there's one way to interpret it, but maybe you can talk a little bit about that and your choice to sort of like have all of these different contrasts in the work. I know you've talked a little bit about these tragic events that felt like you needed to do something that was more than just a silly little bassoon piece or whatever, because that felt like it wasn't responding to the moment in the appropriate way. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. So I took 2 radios and started listening. I had the experience. I tried to simulate the experience that my player was going to have. So I took 2 radios, started listening to the news, or rather to computers, and I would choose news stations and I would overlap them. I did the same thing with traditional Greek music because I wanted that element to be in there as well. And then I had to choose which pieces of news were more important and more devastating and would create, the most intense effect. So the emotional trajectory that my protagonist is following is this. He's just in his little city apartment, minding his business. He's just gotten home. He's wearing his robe. He's got his bassoon. He wants to practice a little bit. So, he listens to Mass as one might do in Greece. You have, Mass on the radio or on the TV. And eventually, so what happens is he switches the station.
Right.
He hears bad news. He tries to control it, right? So he's trying to control his experience, his mood, and block any negative emotions out, any negative news, unpleasant news.
Right.
He does that. Then he changes the station again. More bad news. Look at that. So eventually what happens is he can't control the news anymore. So what happens is he observes the radio. The first time something like that happens is when he stares at a radio and realizes he's not the one who switched it on. So the news are attacking him like his conscience. And then eventually the radios get out of control. They're gonna be playing the negative news whether he wants to listen or not.
Right.
And by closing his eyes, it further, accentuates the fact that no matter what he does, there's no escaping what's happening in his reality. It's just a failed attempt.
Right. Here's an excerpt from Niki's The Blood of Others.
In the meantime, you see things like the opium for the masses, like sports, when Greece won the Euro in 2004, which, by the way, Ben Reuter-Ward watched because he's German-American. And I said, do you know what I'm talking about? Yes. He's like, of course, I watched the Euro in 2004 when Greece won. Nobody ever expected that. So that was, He
had a very personal connection to that.
Exactly. Yes, because he is half European, right? And we know the Euro means so much to Europe. It means more than all of our disasters and our failures together. If you win in sports, then you know how it is.
Right.
The US is the same way. So I just wanted to point out that our priorities are just all wrong.
Right.
And what he looks for is God or sports or some music to dance to, and he's just self-absorbed. And so I wanted to reflect an accurate, average citizen who happens to play bassoon and how they would act in a situation like that.
Yeah, and I think that, you mentioned the opium for the masses. I wonder that, we might perceive this, me speaking from experience, I really don't care for sports. So I don't know about the Euro. I don't know. I'm completely ignorant. And so if people are listening and thinking, oh, what a jerk, it's just how I've always been. And so for me, obviously the priorities of celebrating sports and not paying attention to these horrible, tragic events makes sense. But for someone who's devoted to sports, they might say, well, it's how we cope. Right. And so, I guess it's a very complex thing, and not everyone's going to have the same interpretation of this. But one thing I was thinking about, too, is I could very easily see this adapted for basically any instrument.
Any instrument, thank you. That was precisely my thought. It wasn't intentional,
right?
But it just has happened. It is true that the bassoon really, really matches the clarino. The Greek clarino is like the clarinet, which you hear in the piece.
A woodwind instrument?
Yes, a woodwind instrument. It's like the clarinet with a tweaked mouthpiece a little bit. It allows more air in. And so I do think that the clarino with the bassoon go very well together. But yes, it can be adapted.
Yeah, I could have imagined it for, instruments of a similar register or even a higher register. So
or even accordion.
Tenor, saxophone, flute, all of these, even a string instrument. Because of the sort of the sort of universal qualities that the music has. It's not multiphonics and like all these very specific like bassoon oriented things, which could obviously be adapted, you know, to different instruments specifications. But I think that that's in some ways it can be a very adaptable piece, and it can be presented in a lot of different contexts or ways, and show and expose, like what you said, the typical life of a Greek citizen, just engaging with all of these different things. And I think it speaks to our experience too as people in a modern society of how we try to escape from all of these things. And, you know, sometimes the escape is impossible because of, you know, you mentioned the flooding that happens. Like, how can you escape from that? A pandemic, how can you escape from that? You know, a mass shooting, how can you escape from that? Your community is in mourning. So it's like we try to escape, we try to pretend these things are not happening, but it's impossible. And so I love that your music is sort of pointing to these existential crises that we have of like trying to just carry on with our lives and not being able to escape from our reality.
Yes. Thank you for saying that. And that's another thing that music theater likes to do. Subvert expectations, but in a way that's deeply philosophical and socially relevant without being didactic. I guess this is my most explicit work, but I don't like expressing emotion in a way that's, how can I express that? Forced, I guess. Right? I don't want to force an emotion on anyone. I like exposing a situation.
Yeah.
And just showcasing it rather than, for example, if you're going to talk about war, I'm not the kind of person who's going to take testimonials from, you know, refugees from war-torn countries and turn them into a piece. I'm not going to do that.
Yeah, there are sort of like ethical boundaries that one has to observe.
Exactly. And that's really worth discussing, right? Yeah. When does it become
sort of like an objectification of pain?
Porn, what is it called?
Yeah, something like that. Like sort of like voyeurism of pain.
Exactly. Like tragedy porn is what it becomes.
Yeah.
But what I will do is use a surrealist poem and poet like Enduring Freedom, where war is described as a wedding ceremony and it's celebrated, right? So make a great impression, like, you know, decorate hanging bodies everywhere when you enter as a bride and groom. No one will ever forget. Surprise them with envelopes full of anthrax. It's going to be the best present ever. And, you know, surprise them with ice cream truck bombs. You know, it's like, and so just completely turning it on its head instead of being didactic.
Just sort of like enveloping the concepts in something that's unexpected that forces you to think of the way that I guess sometimes war, at least like the way that government agencies, and I'm super unqualified to talk about this, but it seems like there is like this weird machista approach to celebrating violence and war, and you see this in movies and television, and like the war hero and Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson and like Vin Diesel and all of these like sort of archetypes of masculinity and power that people seem to, for whatever reason, be attracted to, and movies of, you know, explosions and bombs and things like that's like, for whatever reason, society is just completely infatuated with it, and
glorifies violence.
I don't say this as someone like criticizing it from the outside. Like, I've enjoyed my own fair share of seeing these movies, action movies, Tom Cruise and whatever.
Absolutely.
And so I think it's just it's like you said, you're exposing and presenting these things without saying or making any kind of like judgments about it, to let people come to their own conclusions, which I personally appreciate, because one of the reasons that I hate program notes and hate writing program notes is because I don't want to be told what to think about a piece, or I don't want to feel like the piece relies too much on the program notes and doesn't really stand on its own or
make its own statement.
Yeah, it's like you said, like it's a way for a composer to spoon feed an audience a way to think about their music, and I don't really believe in that. But I do feel that in The Blood of Others, you did expertly create this like tapestry of presenting information, and I like that you used more sort of journalistic sources than, you know, anecdotal or testimonial type.
There's no emotion. It's just the facts.
It's just the objective presentation of these events, and what you like the person acting, and which I actually am really curious to talk about as well, the acting aspect of this, but they are responding to these events in a way that feels very organic. And so that's one thing that I was curious about, like from like the acting perspective, since Ben is obviously a musician and this might have put him slightly outside of his comfort zone. I'm curious what that experience was like when you were putting the piece together of like getting him to, you know, do yoga stretches and dance and sort of like
Greek
run
dance.
around and sort of like the acting dimensions of like confusion and sorrow and like frustration, all of those different things, which are the actor's bread and butter. But like a bassoonist, you know, that's maybe sort of Ben might have felt slightly, you know, challenged by that.
My appreciation for Ben, it was all, I didn't think I could appreciate him more. It happened.
Yeah.
He was so ready for every and any challenge, and he did tell me that the piece challenged him in ways he's, you know, never been challenged before.
Totally.
But I do think if we're going to talk about breaking boundaries in art, I mean, this is not even groundbreaking anymore. It's been happening since the 50s, since music theater became a thing.
Even before that.
You're right. And also dance theater, right? Which is also just breaking the boundaries, and Kagel, and, you know, just older. It's already old. So my point is, performers had better be ready.
Right.
It's like if you're ready to spend an eternity on one passage of very difficult music, you can work on your face for a couple of scenes.
True.
Or on a couple of steps.
Totally.
If we're going to be breaking boundaries, if we're going to serve the art.
And honestly, like in that piece, it's not that you have to be a professional actor or dancer. Like, nope. When you're reacting to music or news or anything or dancing in your home, it's like, it's just something that we do. We don't have to be professionals, and we feel comfortable singing with our families, even if we're singing bad, or coloring with our kids, even if we suck at it.
Yes.
You know, things like that. Like, I feel like that's something that the piece sort of exposes, is the amateur musician, the amateur dancer, and kind of like gives them a platform in that piece. So I think that that's one thing that you can tell performers, like, you don't have to be a good dancer, you don't have to be a good actor. We just want to see some, you know, a little bit.
The genuine,
just
reaction.
Some of your own personality.
Exactly. And we're lucky because Ben sort of looks Greek, oddly enough. He has this spectacular beard, which, because we were at the National Hellenic Museum for the premiere, I showed him pictures of all of the priests and the patriarchs and all the important people at church on the first floor, and he looked exactly like them. They all have this spectacular beard. And he has Mediterranean flair, which is just an exceptional coincidence.
Right.
And he's
very worldly,
lucky.
so I think that helps.
That is true. And he had to find a way to sort of understand the Greek. So there were two ways.
That's something I was interested to know about too, because like obviously in the score you have the translation, but like he has to maybe listen for specific phonemes or something to know when they're saying a certain word or phrase to react in a particular way.
Exactly, which brings us to the technical aspects of how do I put this together if I have a non-Greek speaking performer.
Yeah.
So that was a big challenge for the score, and also for the score writing, and for the just putting it together. So what happened is Ben had to listen through all that, but I had the time markings, and the beginning and the ending word, the transcribed sounds of his cues. So this is how the passage begins. This is what you're going to hear. This is what you're going to hear in the end. Yeah. And then... So you
can kind of triangulate with second markings and like those specific words.
Exactly.
What was being said. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, you don't have to know what the entire passage talks about. And if you do
and
a
some
run
of them
through,
are easier, like, go.
Like, that's hard to me.
That's hard to me.
It's like, okay, you get it.
Yeah, go get your soccer trumpet.
Yes. Did you see that in my score where I said, go get the soccer trumpet?
I think, yeah. So.
And your gear and your scarf and your whatever other percussion I had for him. Yes, that's true. And you learn the pacing of it and the approximate duration of it. Also, what's calculated is the distance between the two radios. So just to explain the setup to our viewers, Ben has a backstage area.
Right.
There's 2 hidden speakers in that backstage area, which represent sounds from the outdoors. So, if people are yelling, goal, when a match happens, you can hear it from the houses
streets,
around.
people celebrating.
Exactly. Yeah. There's other sounds you hear too. At some point, there's a paladis coming from the outside, who is usually a Roma scrap collector. And they have this megaphone on their truck. And when you hear them, that's our equivalent of the ice cream truck. When you hear them, you go outside and you give them chairs, old stuff, whatever you got that you want to get rid of. They're gonna take.
It's so nice that there are people devoted to that. Cause
yes,
I would love that if we had that here.
I know, right? And you can hear him. It's like Paladis, Caracles, Cadra, Trapezia, Taperniola, Paladis. Paladis takes everything, right? Bring it all to me. And so he hears all that from the outside. And at the same time, when he enters his living room setup, he has 2 radios, because why not? One on the left and one on the right. And we had to choreograph the number of steps that he would take. That's something he had to learn by calculating the approximate duration of all of the text that we could hear.
Right.
So that's something actually I did in my own time. I set up the radios. I had to know how far away the radios are in order to direct him to go there and turn it off, and go the other way and turn it on.
Because it's an illusion, right? He's not actually turning
the
off.
knobs. Yeah. No, he had to learn to pretend. We also considered doing it with pedals and just real-time changes, but it wasn't worth it.
Yeah.
It was it's fixed anyway.
Yeah.
It's set in stone. So it would just be easier if you
Yeah,
learned
I think logistically that solves a lot of problems.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then
you don't have to worry about it breaking down, because you just need to, press play.
Yes, exactly. So there's a layer of acting. There's a layer of the time that's always running, which is in seconds. Right. There's also staff. Right. A layer of staff, because wherever he plays notes.
Right.
And then, because there's 2 radios, it's very important to have that reflected on the score, because it's relevant.
Right.
Where he goes, radio A or radio B, it's relevant to the score.
Totally.
And then there's 2 more sound sources, the speakers, which which are written as one, right? Because they don't produce independent sounds, actually. So the PA is another layer in the score. And then at the end, the PA sort of takes over, and instead of becoming the outside world, it becomes his conscience.
Right.
Because it's not just
that moment
the
made
radios.
me feel like retroactively, I understood the entire thing almost like a dream, in a way.
Yes.
Sort of like his subconscious trying to grapple with all of these things, because also it's you would think that a piece like this could last easily 45 minutes.
Yes.
But it's like about 15 or 16 minutes,
yes.
more or less, maybe slightly longer than that. And so I think that, dreams feel like that. They feel longer. And they have this kind of episodic nature where like you pivot from one thing to another, and it makes total sense in the dream. But when you think about it afterwards, it's like, how did I get from here to there?
Right.
And so there were these little tiny hints for me personally as a viewer, where I started to feel like it was all a dream, not in a cheesy way.
Right. No, that's really good. I'm glad that you felt that way. The way I thought about it is that it takes over.
Yeah.
It takes it. There's no stopping it.
Right.
It's so big. It's so much bigger than you. It's everywhere, whether you want it or not.
Yeah.
And it does sort of feel like a dream because it's a surreal premise, right? Who has 2 radios?
Who has 1 radio?
Who has 1 radio, right? Also, who dances alone at home? I don't know. I don't know. I dance at home alone. Who plays along with mass?
Right.
The bassoon. You could. It's just things one could do. And one more thing, the events on the radios are from different years.
Right.
So that is the thread. It's the misfortunes of my country throughout the years.
Right.
So we're talking about
and celebrations.
Yes, and celebrations. So we're talking about this year's floods, but winning the Euro in 2004.
Yeah.
Which is which would make sense in a dream, as you say.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, well, Niki, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me about your music. I always learn so much when we talk about your music, about your approach to form, all of these different ways into a work of music. So thank you so much. This has been really fun, and hope we can chat again soon.
Thank you. My pleasure always. I admire you more than anyone as a composer.
Oh, thank you so much. It's so nice to hear, and feeling is mutual.